All right, Moose, we talk about the metaphor of snowmobiles quite a bit. We've have a speech from John Boyd. He's brought it up several times. I definitely want to go through that with you, but I never took the time to think about where did the snowmobile actually come from?
Yeah,
And I don't know about you. Do you know the history of the snowmobile?
I have an idea from
Yeah.
some research I've done through some friends up in the great north, up
So
in the
let's
North
do
Star
this.
State.
I don't know if you have the
I didn't. Let's put it this way: for as much as we talk about snowmobiles, I didn't realize that we were 1 degree of separation away.
I know. We'll introduce our guest here in a moment.
There's no accidents. There's no accidents.
Yeah. So for those listeners that are not familiar and those that are familiar, what I'd like Moose to do, if that's okay with you, Moose, is I have the Harding and Strong Vincent High School speech by John Boyd where he breaks it down. I think you have the text in the chat. Can you walk us through that? Do you have access to that?
Yeah, talking about the imagining different domains, right?
Yeah, let's just walk everybody through that real fast. So
Okay, so John Boyd was trying to get us to destroy and create, like to destroy our perception of reality and create a new one based off of as circumstances unfold and things change. So he says, imagine 4 domains that have nothing to do with each other. And in one quadrant, you have a bicycle. On the other one, you have a skier on the slopes. The other one, you have a boat with an outboard motor. And the other one, you have a tank. And he says, now let's do analysis and synthesis, which was his other component of orientation, which is another word for, destroying and then creating. So by analysis, we'd break down every one of those domains and into their components. So if we look at a bike, we'd say, okay, let's take apart the handlebars, the seat, the chain, the pedals, the spokes, the wheels. The skier on the slopes, we're going to take the skis, the boots, the poles, the snow, the mountain, the chairlift. The boat with an outboard motor, we've got the hull, the motor, the gas, the engine, the fishing tackle. And then the tank, we've got the turret, the gun, the treads, the engine. And he says, now what we're going to do is we're going to cross out and imagine that none of those previous domains exist. So bicycle doesn't exist anymore, skier on the slopes, toy tank, boat with an outboard motor, those things no longer exist. And you're left with a sea of anarchy, all of these components that have nothing to do with each other. But what if we started trying to synthesize something? We've analyzed all this, and that's where most people stop. Now we have to synthesize this. Now let's synthesize this into something that didn't previously exist from all 4 domains that had nothing to do with each other. So we'll take the handlebars, we'll take the seat, the tracks, the snow, the skis, and we realized that we could create a snowmobile. John Boyd, in his revelation, said to us that the difference between a winner and the loser is someone that can make snowmobiles is a winner, and someone who cannot, who is the loser. So we have a winner on with us on the show today. That knows a little bit about making snowmobiles. As we alluded to, as much as we talk about snowmobiles and as much as that's become a symbol for John Boyd, there are no coincidences in the universe. And here we are with 1 degree of separation from the snowmobile.
That's right. Hey, Moose, that was excellent, man. Nice breakdown of the metaphor of snowmobile. Mitchell Johnson's here with us. Mitchell's family created the snowmobile. So Mitchell, welcome to the show. And can you take us back through the history of this snowmobile?
Well, thank you, Ponch. Good to be here. So my father and my uncle founded Polaris Industries right after they got back from Second World War. They were both in the Navy. So they called the company Hattin, Hoist and Derrick. My uncle's name was Edgar Hattin. He married my dad's sister. That's why he's my uncle. My dad was David Johnson. And so they did a lot of inventing of various products to be used in the North Country for farming and agriculture. And they started out with a hoist and derrick. That's why it was called Hattin, Hoist and Derrick. But anyway, moving forward from 1945, when they got back from the Second World War, they incorporated in 1954 as Polaris Industries. They picked up a name from a product they bought in North Dakota from a fellow. And they were building what we knew at the time, or what they called at the time, the straw chopper, for using on a back of combines for harvesting. My father was an outdoorsman. They all were outdoorsmen up here in northern Minnesota on the Canadian border. And my father would snowshoe or walk or ski. He had cross-country skis to this cabin in the woods up north, right on the border. And he said, there's got to be a better way to do this. So, and he was a synthesizer, shall we say, and And he had all these pieces around him. They built grain elevators, which was a chute that had a chain on it and cleats, and it brought the grain up to the elevated the grain up to the bin, and cars around and whatever. And he said, "There's got to be a better way to do this." So he looks around, and one of the things that's become evident to me is that I always used to think I wasn't creative, because I read the comic books, you read the comic books, and you see this bubble over these people, and the light bulb turns on. They invent something out of free space, Well, so I never did anything like that. Well, really, as I matured and grew up, it really, being innovative, in my view, is looking at what you have around you and figuring out how to use that to create something new that hasn't existed before. And so in this case, my father had these grain elevators, and they wanted to go over the snow, and he said he didn't invent the snowmobile. There had been snowmobiles back in Carly Elias, and had a motorized toboggan that was used actually by the military. It had a motorcycle engine on it. Well, he looked around. He had this grain elevator. He tipped it upside down. Now it had cleats pushing it on the ground. Now they got to have a seat to sit on. So how are we going to steer it? Well, they went outside. They got a 36 Chevrolet that was back behind the shop. So what they do, they cut the bumper off, cut it in half, and turned the bumper upside down, and they made skis. Well, now they have to have a steering gear. Well, they had a Model T out in the back that had a planetary steering sector in it. Well, they pulled that out, hooked that up to the skis, and now they have something to steer. So now he is putting these parts together, and he's got friends and workers around him, and they drove it out the door. Didn't work at all. Well, what happened? They went into the snow, and the cleats went directly to the bottom of the snow. Didn't float on the snow at all. So then what did they do? Well, they put canvas. They had canvas sitting in the corner because they used it for some of their other products. They put canvas between the cleats on the track, and then now the cleats then created, or the canvas created a pocket for the snow, so the track didn't go right to the bottom, and then it floated on the snow. So they realized it worked, and they used it for their everyday, getting out to the hunting camp. And then the guy across the street who was a wolf hunter, and he hunted on with snowshoes. He saw that and said, I want to buy that. Well, they sold the first. Dad sold the first one he built for $465, and they started building a second one. And then that was his partner, Alan, built the second one, and there was a logger north of town, and he was using a horse to get out to where he was logging. So he said, "Can I? I'd like to get one of those." And the rest is history. I mean, today there's snowmobiles around the world that are very, are offspring of what was created here in Roseville, Minnesota.
And that was, your father was in the Navy. I want to go back to that. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So a couple of veterans get together, brothers, family members, and they do exactly what you said.
And we should note we're recording this on Veterans Day.
Yeah.
So it's so apropos. It's ridiculous.
And just the metaphor of creating snowmobiles, we talked about that quite a bit. And I think you broke it down, and we want to go deeper with you for sure. But this idea of creativity, just so folks know and you're aware, that the observe, orient, decide, act loop emerged as John Boyd was trying to discover the nature of creativity, right? How do living systems create? And he was looking back at his life and others to figure out what that's all about. And that metaphor pops up quite a bit, the snowmobile metaphor. And today we call it the adjacent possible. Stuart Kaufman talks about this quite a bit. Not everybody needs to know that. It's just, he's talking about snowmobiles. Stuart Kaufman is saying, hey, we have more things today. We can make more things tomorrow. And that's, in order to get to the snowmobile, you had to have the Model T, you had the Chevy, you had the grain elevator. All these things were, again, snowmobiles in their own right, based off of something that was available yesterday, right?
Conceptual spiral.
Yeah, it's
snowmobiles.
Yeah, Moose, any thoughts on this? This is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, what Mitchell just shared with us was, first of all, was a perfect example of Boyd's your dad and your uncle did exactly what John Boyd talked about, the difference between a winner and a loser. And of course, Polaris is a winning organization. I know I love, even though I went to college in Milwaukee, I'm actually partial to Indian motorcycles versus Harleys. So I know that Polaris owns Indian now, but I think that's important because it's living proof. And the metaphor, I mean, the book that just came out that Ian Brown and Franzo Singer wrote is called Snowmobiles and Grand Ideals. And it's almost like the snowmobile is like the mascot of John Boyd type thinking, because what he's talking about is exactly what Mitchell, what your dad and your uncle did. They broke down things that didn't have anything to do with the other and created something completely novel that, for those that use them, we don't have many of them here in Manhattan that I'm aware of. I've not yet seen one, but where the snowmobile is used, it's become synonymous. Do you know what your dad and your uncle, like, they were Navy veterans. What did they do in the Navy?
Dad was in China, and he was on a ship there. They were in the process of turning over. The war was winding down. They were turning over the U.S. ships to to Chiang Kai-shek in what became the Taiwan exodus. And so they were training. He was actively training the Chinese nationals how to run these ships. He was in the engine room, and he talks about how they shut him down because the mufflers were leaking, and they'd flood the engine room. And so he said he spent his time whittling on wood to pound them into the mufflers until he could get it welded to keep the salt water from spraying all over the engine room. But I mean, my point is being creative with what's around you. You got some wood, and you got a whittler, and you got engine water spraying all over. Well, we got to fix this. So,
do you know what your uncle did in the Navy?
I don't. He had an early medical discharge. He came home early, and I sat around listening to my dad's stories. So I don't know what he did. He was. I don't know that he was in China.
Yeah,
he was stationed somewhere else.
Well, Ponch and I are extremely biased to the naval forces of our country. I'm a former Marine captain, and Ponch is a retired Navy captain. And when I think of the way you just described your dad, first of all, I think that just because that we deal with this sea, which is always changing and always fluctuating, you have to be creative, and you have to be on your game. But also too, when you're on a ship, and having lived on ship, and Ponch has also lived on ships, once you're out there, what you have is what you have. What you've got is what you got. So if he was doing things creatively to satisfy things, like, it's interesting that he would eventually create the snowmobile, because that's exactly what you would have learned in the Navy and the Marine Corps, is how to jerry rig things, with what you got, because you can't go to Walmart, you can't go to Home Depot when you're out deployed on a ship. So, I mean, it seems like that kind of ingenuity that I imagine he had it before he went into the Navy, but I'm sure that the Navy kind of honed that.
Well, certainly, he talks fondly about his time in the Navy and working with what they had, so to speak. And he grew up Swedish immigrants, and I told some stories of Ponch, but they had what they had up in northern Minnesota. For example, Polaris in the early days, they're 400 miles north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. That's where they got the steel. That's where they got most of their stuff. And 400 miles in those days was a long, long way from where they were. So most everything they did was what they could put together from what was around them in terms of what the things they had at hand.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you
imagine Polaris dealing with global supply lines and supply chains and air freight and everything is probably very different.
Yeah.
Things have changed. Different.
So 1956-ish, I think we have the snowmobile, the evolution of the company. You get some fast followers, you get some companies that are copying you, not only in the snowmobile, but other ways. Can you talk a little bit more about the maturity of the company, or the evolution of the company into what it has become today?
Well, sure. So just a comment here. So this was 56, 1960. Edgar, Dad's boyhood friend and brother-in-law, said, we got to figure out how to promote this. So Edgar cooked up a trip with a bush pilot up in Alaska who was originally from Roseau, and they decided to, and they worked with the Air Force, and made a trip with a snowmobile well, with 4 people, 3 snowmobiles from the Bering Sea, Bethel, all the way to Fairbanks, up the Kuskokwim River and across the Yukon Portage over to the Yukon River and Fairbanks, Tanana River and Fairbanks. It was over a month's trip. Anyway, Edgar commented that they only, all they saw was dog teams as transportation. So, and that was in 1960. I remember I was 11 years old. I remember when the truck left town with the snowmobiles, and Edgar was off, and I was just all excited, but I couldn't go along. Only 11 years old, had to go to school. But in 2000, which would be 40 years later, I had the occasion to lead a trip with my father and my uncle Edgar, and we retraced the trip that Edgar made and visited with some of the very people who remember when Edgar came through 40 years later. My point is, all they saw was dog team. We didn't see one dog team except a few that were training for racing. All we saw was snowmobiles. And snowmobiles had radically changed the whole transportation of Alaska. And there aren't roads to these villages, but we went from village to village, stayed in the gymnasiums, and we came through, and it was fascinating to see how things had changed in 40 years. So then going on with Polaris, they did very well in snowmobiles, but they also saw an opportunity they were in off-road vehicles, and they said, well, and they were, everything they did was outdoors. They and Polaris saw an opportunity with ATVs. And Honda started the ATV business with their ATC, and became quite popular through the 70s. Yeah, through the 70s and into the 80s. Well, in 85, Polaris decided they were doing well in snowmobiles. They decided to get into ATVs. And so again, we have some of this synthesis going on. And the culture that was developed within Polaris is, well, we're not going to build just a Honda. And there was Kawasaki and Yamaha. There was the big four were Japanese companies. So we came to the ATV business, and we're laughed at, really, because we had we used what we had at hand. We had 2-stroke engine. We had a rubber bell CVT. 2-stroke engines came from snowmobiles. The rubber bell CVT came from snowmobiles. We had all the competitors. We built our first prototypes, and we were in the big four from Japan. They came from a motorcycle heritage, and they had a good product. But now we've got we're developing our first one. We see an opportunity. I was there, and in the interim, I'd got my engineering degree and had been to business school. We said, well, we're not going to build a Honda. We took what we had. Snowmobiles had long travel suspensions. Motorcycles have they drive on roads. They have very short travel suspensions. We would ride these ATVs, and we thought they were terrible. You're driving for 1 hour, and it was like riding an ironing board. They had foot pegs. And so we went and drove. I tell the story of Dalton the Cell. We were out in the woods here south of town. Where's Dalton? Well, he was with us, and we were riding the competitors' machines. We were still in the process of figuring out what we're developing our own. Oh, let's go back and find him. So there's Dalton on this hill. Both his feet had slipped off the foot pegs, and he was pinned. The back wheels were over his ankles. He couldn't move on a downhill slope. Well, we have running boards on snowmobiles. Let's just put running boards on these ATVs. So they put running boards on. We had a rubber bell CVT. We had 2-stroke engines. There were automatic transmissions. The CVT is constant velocity transmission. That came from snowmobiles. So you didn't have to shift. And they were just easy to drive compared to having to figure out what gear you are, shift in off-road conditions. And so we came to the marketplace with a snowmobile heritage a snowmobile viewpoint, an operational psychology, shall we say, and we were laughed at. Okay, this is in 1985. 1895, we had caught up to all the big three. Where was one ahead of us, Honda. By 2000, we had passed Honda. Today we are number one in ATVs, and it's not that. I mean, they've got good machines. Honda pioneered the ATV market with their ATC, but Polaris came with a different mentality, and now all the manufacturers build a Polaris derivative, essentially, the Sportsman 500, which changed the ATV business. The Sportsman 500 is the iconic ATV, and it is now, well, it's the all-time number one model sold in the industry. And it's the more, and if I want to brag a little bit, I was the leader of that whole program. And, I learned a few things from my dad, and I'm thankful for that.
I grew up on farms in Colorado, and we had the 3-wheel ATVs back then, where I remember that situation where your feet would get pinned underneath the back tires. That's one situation. The other one is, of course, the 3-wheeler, you're going to flip over it quite a bit. So bumping around. And that was in the late 70s, early 80s when I was riding those. And then fast forward to about, I think 3 years ago. So 2022, we're in South Dakota. And what are we driving around in? These big ATVs that had Polaris on the side, or I think on the back. So, I mean, it's an amazing upgrade. And by the way, those are fun to drive in the Dakota mountains. I'm just driving around and having a blast in those. So I know what it's like to flip a 3-wheeler or an old school ATV.
I grew up in Western PA in Pittsburgh, and that was always like the thing, like people would say, because you say roll them and flip them, like you're not allowed to ride on a trike or a 3-wheeler. Johnny so and so got his head cut off.
Yeah.
But you also too, Polaris makes slingshots, and you see those driving around.
Well, yes, and that's a unique vehicle, and that was developed when I was still at Polaris, and there's always this tension, shall we say, and that is, how do you come with something new but not be so radical that you lose some of the heritage, shall we say?
Mm-hmm.
And the slingshot, I think, is a great vehicle, and it hasn't taken off, shall we say, like the ATV and then the UTV Ranger, but it's a fine vehicle, and I don't, I come more from the innovative engineering side of things, but I did run the off-road division at Polaris at one time. And one of the things I learned there was, just because you build a better mousetrap doesn't mean the world beats a path to your door. You've got to sell it, you've got to market it, you've got to develop it, and that happens by being on the ground with the customer, with the product. You need to understand and know the product as well as your customer, but then of course you've got to listen to your customer so that you can continue to develop. My point is, we came with the Sportsman 500. We said we're not, so we were in the ATV business. We had a rear swing arm suspension, and we were coming with the with what became the Sportsman 500. We were told by our marketing people that we needed, and we agreed. I mean, sure, we need a shaft drive. We had a chain drive to the rear as a swing arm suspension, rode great, had floorboards, all these things, but we needed shaft drive, and so we came with this shaft drive, which basically I welded the swing arm to the transmission, and then now we had a stiff vehicle. We had to put an independent rear suspension on. The independent rear suspension was, we weren't the first one to invent an independent rear suspension. Suzuki had them with 2 inches of travel. Well, we came with independent. I just hired a suspension guy out of Ford. I said, Jeff, you got to make an independent rear suspension, but long travel. He made an independent rear suspension on the Sportsman that had 11 inches of travel. But we said, yeah, that's great. When I drove it, didn't work. It would tip over and And so one of the snowmobile guys, we worked all in the same shop, engineering shop. One of the snowmobile guys looked at it and said, well, of course that won't work. You need an anti-roll bar like we have on snowmobiles, the torsion bar. So Jeff was devastated. Ed came and said, let's put a torsion bar on it. That afternoon, they're out running and it works fine. So the guys are working together. The lot of cross-pollination. The torsion bar, the anti-roll bar, came right from the snowmobile. That was in the same shop, 20 feet away. And sometimes you can't see things, but if you look around and pay attention, many times your solutions are right in front of you.
Yeah.
And we're blind to them.
That's it's what's grabbing the stories you're telling and showing about how you have to keep building snowmobiles. And I mean, you're doing it in the literal sense. Polaris is still making snowmobiles, but in the Boyd sense, metaphorically, keep making snowmobiles. It seems like you guys are always shattering models and writing new stuff. And you're no longer limited in snowmobiles because you do off-road vehicles, as you said, the motorcycles, and then boats too.
Yeah. Hey, Moose, I think one of the compelling parts of this conversation is what Mitchell is saying is supports what natural science and OODA Loop says, and that's to be focused on the external environment, distributed decision-making, empowering those that are closest to the customer to make those decisions and have that discourse within our organization, have those challenges and be respectful and have that respectful truth over artificial harmony, focused on what's right, not who's right. So the stories that Mitchell's telling are discovered from the heritage of the family. It sounds like it was part of their DNA, if you will, to do these things. And that's carried throughout the history of the company and companies. But most organizations can't figure this stuff out. They struggle with this, right? They don't know that you need to let your frontline workers make decisions. We're seeing this in sports. We just had folks talk about constraints-led approach. You need to let your players make real-time decisions on the court, on the field. You give them the tools they need, the constraints they need to do that. And that's exactly, I just want to point this out, that this isn't new. This isn't like a very unique thing. This is how you do business. This is how you create new things.
So it's supposed to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guarantee you, the Johnsons didn't know John Boyd's OODA Loop. They didn't go to a class on this. You don't need to go to a class on this, right? It could just emerge sometimes. But what we're offering folks is insights into how this actually works. What does the OODA Loop mean? What does disruption and creation mean? What does the world of reorientation mean? And this is it. It's creating novelty, which is what John Boyd was trying to understand when he created the OODA Loop or sketched the OODA Loop. How did a living system, somebody like him, create the energy maneuverability theory, come up with the aerial attack study, understand cognitive task analysis, do these things when experts are out in the field and they can't do the same, right? So I just want to point that out to our listeners that's what I'm hearing from Mitchell.
Yeah,
on this. Oh, this is fantastic, Mitchell.
It's an amazing story, Mitchell. It's such a great. I was just remarking to someone earlier about unfortunately America anymore. I don't think we have like the things that you're talking about, like your dad and your uncle, like figuring out ways and finding out ways and just having the ability to just do it and then create something completely novel and then just keep going. It's a great model for others to
well, and then do it, you'll learn.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just contemplate and figure you do something and you learn. And that's where I think we had a big strength. I used to ride with our test drivers. I used to meet them at the back door at 3:00 when they came in for the afternoon, because I needed to understand, as I moved up in management, I needed to understand what was happening on the ground with them. And I would try to ride with them at least once every week, because they would teach me so much. Now I'm an outdoor person and I rode a lot, but you gotta be in touch with two things: the product and the customer, because you don't represent all customers. You have a perspective from your standpoint. And I mentioned about innovation in terms of the product. There's innovation in terms of the market and learning all this too. And we brought some of that same culture. And I mentioned to Ponch in an earlier talk with him, when we came out with the Sportsman 500, The rear swing arms, you could sit on them and you could bounce on the showroom floor. And oh, this is a great suspension. This is really nice. The Sportsman 500 had an independent rear suspension. When you bounced on it, it had to go sideways. So if it was static, sitting on the showroom floor, you bounce on it and then it wouldn't move. You had to be rolling. So, and the Sportsman 500 wasn't selling. We thought it was great. Well, we were in NASCAR at the time. I was heading up the off-road division. We were in NASCAR, and we had a driver drove the Polaris Remington car. His name was Rick Mast. Well, what are we going to do about this? So we put a trailer behind our NASCAR, drove around the Darlington. This is all on video. Drove around the Darlington racetrack. Rick Mast driving the car. He stopped, unloaded the Sportsman 500 from the trailer, swung his leg under, got on the Sportsman 500. We had video on the suspension. The suspension was just moving wildly. He was going through railroad ties and rocks, and then he stopped. He swings his leg over, turns around, looks at the camera, and says, "You got to ride it to believe it," in his southern accent. "You got to ride it to believe it." And that is so true, because what happened is we have people on the showroom floor sitting on it saying, "This isn't a very good suspension. You got to ride it to believe it," meaning that's, you experience the product. Well, it was interesting. Sportsman 500s weren't selling very well. We started running that ad on Monday. By Friday, this is unbelievable. We watched the sale just take off. And it was, you got to ride it to believe it. That's it applies to so much in life. You got to ride it to believe it. You got to experience it. This has to become a part of you in terms of what your passion and what you want to do with the product and how to use it.
We feel that in what we do. We have a saying that once you see it, you can't unsee it, right?
Can't
But
unsee
you
it.
have to get there first. You actually have to do it. You have to learn. You have to probe and do those things. Mitchell, this has been awesome. Can you kind of take us home and wrap it up and let our listeners know where they can find what you're doing now and what's next in either of the companies that you're working with?
Well, the story goes on. I mean, you replay this story. So I talked about the ATV and the Sportsman 500. The Ranger is now a ubiquitous vehicle almost in the marketplace. The Ranger UTV, Polaris is by far the leader there. I headed up that program and project at Polaris, and we reinvented the UTV. What am I doing today? I'm still working with Polaris. I'm not an employee there, but help out with things, and I have a company alongside Polaris where we do CVT and for Polaris vehicles and track systems for Polaris vehicles that are quite unique in the marketplace. And then now I've just recently got into boats. We have a product that Winnipeg Yawl that I've been up north in the Canadian lakes and even up in the Arctic, and they have these commercial fishing hulls that are small boats for big water. And so now I've started building these for the sport fishing market, where we've got Lake Superior and Lake of the Woods and some of these big lakes where the normal run-of-the-mill boats don't work well in these conditions. So I'm just, I guess, finding these things that I have passion for and enjoy life.
That's fantastic. Well, hey, we appreciate you being on with us here on No Way Out. I'm going to turn it over to Moose to kind of take us home. Moose, want to put a nice bow on this for everybody?
Yeah, Mitchell, we really appreciate you coming on and showing us the real world manifestation of what John Boyd was exactly talking about, that he's metaphorically describing creating snowmobiles, and your dad and your uncle did it. Absolutely did it. I'd be curious to go through and ask, maybe Punch, we ask Mary or Chuck, I wonder if Boyd had even looked into.
May have. We don't know.
That's an interesting thought. Anyway.
No, thanks again for your time. So we'll keep you on here for a second. And thanks again for being on No Way Out.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.